Hi, good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks for joining. My name is Dushyant Sanathara. I'm the general manager for PSI's healthcare, finance, and ICT business. Before we kick on with the information session, there are a few housekeeping things. So all of you have joined in a muted mode. You can certainly ask any questions if you've got. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We really want this session to be more engaging. It's probably not about us and what the scheme involves. We want it to be addressed in a way wherein what are the questions you want to ask, and we want to try and facilitate that as much as possible. If there are any other questions that are unanswered, unaddressed, you can even reach out to me after the session if that works for you as well. Before we kick on with the session, we will also have a small poll that will start. The idea of the poll is to understand what are some of the things that you would like out of today's session, and I will try and I shouldn't say tweak, but I'll try and address some of those questions that you have as much as possible to make it amply clear for you guys. So the poll's open now. I assume you guys all can see the options. You can choose more than one option. Doesn't have to be all of it, 2, 3, or maybe a single area that you really want to get out of today's session. All done? Okay, let's kick on with the session then. So today's agenda, we'll go through and we'll talk about the ISM, what ISM is, where it comes from, and try and explain this as much as possible. We would also want to touch on what the DESE scheme is all about and what the provider's pathway looks like. We will touch on the BSI's audit process, and then we'll also talk about, we'll have a Q&A session towards the end. So my idea is to try and wrap up the session for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll spend the remaining 15-20 minutes primarily on questions and answers that you've got. And I can touch on, if you're interested, I also can touch on some of the experiences we've had with the number of providers who have gone through the process as well, if that makes it easier for you guys. So what's ISM? Where does it come from? So Information Security Manual, that's the full form of ISM, is only a small part of Australian government's cybersecurity governance framework. So there are many areas, number of different departments working on it, but the main area is the Protective Security Policy Framework, which is run by the Attorney General's Department. Then we get into ASD, which is the Australian Signals Director and Australian Cybersecurity Center that I'm sure a lot of people in security may be familiar with. They have 3 areas that they focus on. One of them being ISM, which is the manual. We're looking at Essential 8 maturity model. And then the third one being strategies to mitigate cybersecurity incidents. The fourth one is the intelligence organization, which is ASIO, which focuses on T4 protective security and physical security. What's PSPF? So PSPF was obviously revised in October, and it is looked at fairly frequently, same as some of the other areas like ISM and the Essential 8 maturity models. They are being reviewed frequently and amended as and when required. The PSPF framework covers 5 principles, 4 outcomes, and 16 core requirements that articulates, what entities must do to achieve the desired protective security outcomes, and these desired security outcomes come from what the government really wants us to look at. Most core areas have several supporting requirements as well, and that are intended to facilitate a standardized approach in implementing security across the government. There is plenty of guidance available on how PSPF requirement can be delivered or is being delivered. The reason I talked about PSPF is when we look at the 4 outcomes, that's governance, information, personnel, and physical. Personnel is an area where it has a huge amount of ISM focus, and that's what we are going to talk today, or try and explain a bit today. I'm sure a lot of people who've been in this area understand a bit about ISM, but it's basically a requirement that changes or evolves very, very frequently. When we're talking about something that had around 945 controls in 2017 to 700 controls that got reduced in January 2020, but when I look at the September 2021 version, it's probably around over 815 odd controls that are there now. Since it's released, there are monthly updates. In some cases there aren't, because between June and September this year there was only one update, and we haven't had any updates in between. But usually you tend to see a lot of updates, and the update means not every single control has been amended. There are certain controls being reviewed and amended as required, or in some cases new controls being introduced, and I'll talk about what and how they look like. The reasons for update are many. It could be an update to a particular technology, for example, update to the approach to the structure of and preparing security documentation, or it could be updating the approach to security assessment and accreditation. So there are varied reasons, but I think the most common one is the changes in technology and the enhancements that are required that the government reviews and make sure those are updated swiftly across the ISM requirements. As far as the authority and the applicability is concerned, the bodies are subject to PGPA Act. There is a ministerial direction. There are state and territory agencies that implement PSPF. It applies everyone. But the focus here for us today is that the service providers, which most of you are, have a deed of agreement with government, and the deed says that you are accessing some sensitive or classified information, or I should say PII information, which is what government wants to protect. And any organization, so it's an open framework, so any organization that chooses to say that we want to up our NT as far as security requirements are concerned, and we want to align ourselves with the ISM controls, they are free to do so. As far as the applicability is concerned, the PSPF definitely references ISM. The ISM states that, or represents the considered advice from ACSC within the ASD, and this advice is provided in accordance with ASD's designated function under paragraph 1 of the Intelligence Act 2001. There is also a proviso for material advice or any other assistance to any person or body that on matters relating to security. So I have seen a number of examples where SCSC have gone over and beyond and have shared information for organizations to understand, implement, provide update on security or security related concerns. So I think it's very, very handy, and I would suggest everyone who haven't to try and subscribe to the updates that are released from ACSC frequently. I think it's really, really helpful. As far as the classification and is concerned of the information, which is extremely important, we're talking about, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, we're talking about what's official, what's officially sensitive, then the classified information which is protected, secret, and top secret, and that is purely based on the business impact. So either it's low to medium, high, extreme, or catastrophic impact, and then what happens if the information is compromised or confidentiality is gone, whether it poses damage, insignificant damage or a limited damage to a particular organization, government, and then followed on with serious damage and exceptionally grave damage, depending on what's the kind of information that's there. A lot of providers in this space primarily have information that's sensitive. It's O in most cases. We usually don't come across S or secret or top secret information, at least in this space. There are certain clients, certain areas where there is, but not necessarily for the providers in this space. And there are a lot of useful links, and just for everyone's knowledge, we will ensure that you receive a copy of the recording and the presentation for you to keep in reference. But what we've done here is provided a link to each one of those areas that we've just spoken about. Now, before we jump on to the ISM and the scheme requirements itself, I thought it would be a very good idea to try and explain you some of the changes that have happened. September 2021, when the ISM was updated, what I've done is I've picked 3 or 4 controls that were updated, and I'm going to try and share what that update looks like and what does it mean. So on the left hand side, and this is publicly available on the SCSC website, so you should be able to download an Excel sheet which is called NX controls. You should be able to download it and see all the controls. What it does, it gives you guidelines on what it is related to. It covers the section, it covers the topic, and every control has a unique identifier, which is a control number. It has a revision on it, and I've deliberately picked a couple of controls that are 4th or 5th revisions, and I've also picked the new controls being introduced, and I'll talk about why. And then it also covers what's the level of information we are talking about, which is secret, top secret, official, or not. So, and what is the description of the control? What I would recommend for any organization going through the process for DESE scheme would be to download the latest version of the ISM controls. And it has one more section after description where any provider can go through each one of those controls individually and be able to outline how they are implementing the controls, if it is applicable to them, and if it is not, obviously a justification of why it's not applicable. So the first couple of them are the controls where we're talking about what and how the equipment register needs to be maintained, or what is required when it comes to sanitizing network devices. But the last two, for example, guidelines on media. Now this is a new control. So when you see revision 01713, which talks about the removal of media register, September 21 is when it was introduced. And what it says is a removal media register is maintained and regularly identified. So any organizations currently who have already implemented ISM controls or are in process of that should look at that control and say, okay, fair enough. Do we have a register in place? If you do, not an issue. The second question is, are we maintaining it? But if you haven't, because it wasn't in any of the previous ISM controls, and if you don't have within your organization, then that needs to be looked at. The question is, do you have removable media in your business? If the answer to that is yes, then obviously that's something that you do need to look at. The second one, for example, is guidelines on system hardening, which then talks about which relates back to what I originally said, that when any technological updates available or is there, and those are frequently reviewed and being updated. In this case, I11 should be disabled or removed, and something that organizations do need to look at how they are managing that to make sure their system is hardened enough. So just as an example, I mean, there are plenty other areas as well, but I thought I'll just give you a couple of examples and try and explain what and how that needs to be approached. DESE scheme. The object of the conformity for this scheme is ISMS, which is the Information Security Management System, and the environment of the contracted service providers. Okay, so that's that's the key area. What are we looking at? Because we are engaging with helping or assisting people with work or looking for work or anything related. The information is sensitive. It's a personal PII information, and that's why it needs to be controlled. The objective of this scheme is fairly simple. It is to supplement the basic minimum requirements of 27001, which is the internationally accredited international standard for information security. But what we're trying to do is we're making sure by having ISO 27001 is that we have an overarching governance framework which follows the path of plan, do, check, and act over and beyond the controls that we already have within the NXA of 27001, plus making sure that the ISM controls that we just spoke about, 800 odd controls, are looked at, reviewed, and updated as and when required. The scheme covers all the international criteria that we would follow anyways for as part of the accreditation process for 27001. So it's no different. So it covers the same requirements that we have to follow for 27001. It also covers the same requirement for us to deliver the work. So when it says IFMD4, it's a criteria whereby we are in a position, as in when I say we, BSI, are in a position to deliver the audit remotely as well, like any other scheme that we're currently auditing. The discretionary elements of the SOA, which is statement of applicability under 27001, that those are being supplemented through the official controls, ISM controls, as I just mentioned. And please note that because those controls are updated regularly, I would strongly endorse and urge that people within those organizations or within providers review and look at those controls on a periodic basis, and also see whether they are applicable or not. And if it is, then that needs to be planned to ensure that those controls are followed through. As far as the accreditation and impartiality requirements are concerned, they are no different than any other scheme that BSI is part of. JASNS is accredited and is managing the scheme, but the scheme owner is DESE. And BSI has gone through its audit or is about to complete the accreditation to this scheme. We've gone through our audit process and everything else that needed to be done from our end. Provider's pathway. So what does the DESE journey look like with BSI? I would start off on something peculiar which comes up and has been a lot of discussion in the past with a lot of providers we have. And I wanted to focus primarily starting with the audit duration, because that's where a lot of discussion starts. So in general, the way to look at the DESE scheme requirements is that if a provider has gone through ISMS, which is 27001 requirements, the audit time usually is threefold. So if for an organization having 1 to 5 employees, if the duration is 5 days, for DESE, for an equivalent organization with a similar risk level, would be close to 15 days. That's kind of where it looks like. And the reason for threefold increase in the days is primarily we're talking about 110 odd controls comparing with 800 odd controls, which we do need to go through each one of those controls. Even if they are not applicable, we need to go through and make sure that that justification has been looked at fairly closely. And while doing so, we need to ensure we are following all the requirements and protocols of ISMS, which is making sure the scope's appropriate, covering all the necessary sites, people within the scope of the certification, as well as making sure that the risk level is looked at very closely. The reductions in the audit times are afforded or can be afforded to clients that hold accredited certification already, and I will touch on it at a depth in some of the other slides that are following up. The factors for adjusting time and everything else are no different. It starts with how we would deal with ISMS as in 27001. However, there is a caveat. It's a very, very important one. There have been instances where we've seen a provider's audit duration has been significantly high. So for example, we're talking 70, 80, 90 days of audit days in certain cases. But DESE has been kind enough, and they've said that if the durations are excessive, and then BSI are in a position to convey the concerns to DESE, seek clarification or reduction in audit duration. And obviously in doing that process, we have to justify as to why we think we can reduce the duration significantly based on what we have seen as part of our stage 1 audit, as well as whatever the conversations our auditors have had with the providers in terms of maturity of their system. There has been a factor that needs to be looked at, which is what we call as end users per annum. So the question comes up: we are a new provider, we don't know, we don't have n number of users for past 3 years, we only have data available for 2 years. Fair enough, we can take that into account. But the way it works is, depending on the number of users per annum, the activity levels, which is the review or the audit time, increases from 10% to up to 45%. As I said, in case of the new organization that have not yet commenced or have been operating for less than 3 years, we are happy with the projected numbers of end users, and that should be fine. Any organizations that have had caseload of less than 2,000, they're not mandatorily required to go through the process, and that's when the scheme started. However, I've seen that there are a number of organizations who want to go through the process for 2 reasons. One is obviously going through the tendering process. They want to demonstrate that they comply with 27001 requirements to start with, and will follow up with the DESE requirements. But the second also being making sure that the risk that comes across an unaccredited or unaudited management system, ISMS system, is also covered off. So I think there are a couple of reasons what I've seen why organizations are preempting and saying, or even though it's not a mandatory requirement, we want to make sure that we cover up the risk for information security, as well as we are able to demonstrate to regulators, which is DESE in this case, that we and our system is compliant and meeting the requirements of an international standard. Expedited audit duration. So this is an approach that some organizations have already taken. What this approach means is, if you or any provider that have gone through the process and are currently certified to 27001, what does that look like for them? Because you've already demonstrated that you've got a management system in place, a governance system in place, which is capable of planning, doing or executing, checking periodically, reviewing, and making changes or continual improvement as and when required through ISMS. So in that advent, we are able to reduce the audit time by greater than 66%. And as long as the duration is not less than 5 days, we are able to execute the audit. Having said that, we will try and look at the maturity of your systems as well, but that is something that is allowable. So an organization taking a 2-step process can get a significant reduction in the cost as well if they decide to do so, which is going through ISMS. If there is no timeline or deadline that you need to meet, external, I mean internal, there could be timelines given by the board or the CEO or CISO. But if there are no external deadlines or timelines, they can go through a 2-fold process using getting accredited or certified to ISMS, and then going through the DESE ISMS scheme. These reductions are also applicable for surveillance reduction and recertification audits. As far as the 27001 is concerned, not every organization needs to choose to go through 27, so you can just opt for a DESE scheme for ISMS, or you can opt for 27 and DESE ISMS. It's optional, but I can just say that I have seen, as far as BSI is concerned, not a single client who just opted for DESE ISMS, because the amount of work is probably a bit more, not less. So we're covering off the requirements for 27001. Hence, the clients are more than happy to receive a certificate for 27001 as well. Audit process. So as far as the certification audit process is concerned, the process is very, very similar to anything that you've gone through previously for any management system. So we start with a stage one called as a document review, but in most cases, the stage one is slightly heavy. When I say heavy, is we're looking at 4 to 5 days of stage one. If you're going through the DESE process straight away, and that is to make sure we are looking at all the requirements, and we are going through your statement of applicability and looking at all the controls. So we're talking about 800 odd controls and seeing what's and how it's being implemented. That's probably where we spend a lot of time on making sure we've got that knotted down. The second, and then followed by that, is your stage two, where we will obviously cover all the sites that are within the scope. We'll have conversations with the employees, starting from the management through to the people using the management system or part of the management system, part of the scope of the management system. And then followed that would be your routine, 12 monthly surveillance audits and recertification audits at the end of 3 years. However, there are certain mandatory requirements that are really, really important, and some of those requirements are also covered as part of your deed as the provider. And one of the key areas, and this has been a focus area for DESE as well as for JASANS and everyone involved in this scheme, is around breach notification. So for us, we have to notify the department, which also means that we expect providers who are audited by us or going through the auditing process notify us of the breach. What we expect is we want to know the nature of the information, the extent of potential damage to the provider or end users, and what are the immediate planned actions that are being taken by the providers to reduce the extent of potential harm. We understand that as part of your deed, you have to do it to notify department, but we also need to do so. So we expect providers to inform us for us to make sure we follow our due diligence process as part of our requirement. Just making sure that a BSI auditor will monitor the actions to comply, but we are not responsible for following up actions on data breach, which we will not. If the auditor is not satisfied with the compliance with regards to the notifiable data breach, and see that they're unlikely to meet the scheme requirements within the 7 days, the auditor will take relevant actions. But primarily, our role is to try and focus and monitor on the actions that are being taken, or planned actions that were taken, and how they've gone about it. I think I've covered this initial certification process. There is one key piece of difference between a routine 27001 audit and DESE ISMS, which is to make sure that we are covering the official ISM version at every single port of call. So when you start a process with PSI, we have a specific form that obviously asks the official version of ISM that you're currently working on or planning to get certified to. The same information has to flow through within the executive summary of the audit report as well, whether it's a stage 1 audit report or a stage 2 audit report. And we also need to make sure that there is an unambiguous statement which talks about the compliance with regards to the cybersecurity requirements and the contractual applications with the department. We're looking at the official ISM that's been enforced, but should not be older than three calendar months. So for example, if someone's getting or planning to get certified by January last year or December last year or December this year, they need to make sure that 3 months out, whatever the ISM control version has been released is something that they do need to take into account when they are talking about implementing. Optionally, if and this is an option available, if applicable and justified by the audit team and subsequent post-audit records, the current version of official ISM in force at any time of the certification is also possible. We also need to make sure that anything in relation to data breach is documented within the audit report so that the department or any other regulator can see that that's been covered up as part of our process. As far as maintaining the certification is concerned, which is your surveillance audit primarily, most of the work that's being done is fairly similar, but there are certain areas where we need to make sure are covered up, and those are the two areas that I've highlighted. First being that if a new version of an official ISM control has been published within 3 months of your planned surveillance audit, you need to ensure or undertake a self-assessment against the new or the modified subset of controls. So when I say new or modified, if you looked at the previous examples, there were 4 controls that were shown. There were a couple of controls that were on version 5, which means they were modified, but there were a set of new controls being introduced. So I have to make sure that there is a process in place where a planned review or a self-assessment it's been taken care of. And I would see this as no different than conducting an internal audit. For any international standard, including ISO 27001, it's a mandatory requirement for organizations to conduct an internal audit. Internal audit can be done at different intervals, whether you're doing it fortnightly, quarterly, 6 monthly, or annually. It doesn't matter, but it has to be done once at least in a year between audits. And I see self-assessment being fairly similar approach, where you're making sure that the controls are looked at and there is a process in place. From our perspective, when we go through a surveillance audit, we will look at what is the current enforced version of the official ISM, and BSI will raise non-conformities against any modified timeframes as per the rules of the scheme. So it doesn't require for you to complete all the actions, because in some cases when we're talking about a control being modified, that may require an investment, a planned investment, for example, and it may go through a process. For us, we will raise that as a non-conformity, which means the department can certainly see. You're not required to close them off. We can certainly look at the subsequent audits. If you obviously have a modified time frames and you're able to close it fairly quickly, not an issue, but that's something that we have to continuously do. And because we don't know when the latest version of ISM is updated, our auditors need to be updated on a frequent basis around the changes that have come through, what do those changes mean, and how do they apply to each of those providers that we are auditing. Recertification audit, fairly similar process from what we've talked about for surveillance audit. So we have to look at what is the latest version of ISM. Just an FYI, I think I've covered this before as well, but we are in a position to conduct remote audits, or we can also conduct hybrid audits, where is part of the audits done on site, part of the audits done remotely. Those both are possible. But having said that, JASANS obviously is reviewing the scheme on an ongoing basis, and so is DESE. If there are any planned changes or anything, we will ensure that all providers are notified of any changes that happen. And obviously, DESE is doing at their end, but we'll try and cover that at our end as well. Just the last bit, I did touch on the self-assessment. So self-assessment itself is not a grounds to terminate a recertification audit, or is not a ground to raise a non-conformity. So BSI will not raise a non-conformity if a self-assessment is not done. However, the internal audit requirement is an ISO 27001 requirement. So if an internal audit is not done within the same period, then that is something that BSI will certainly raise that as a non-conformity. I just wanted to try and clarify the difference with both. I think I've covered a lot of this, but just want to touch and highlight the fact that's in red, that if there is any subsequent version of official ISM and its closure is impractical or unreasonable to expect under a default or modified timeframes in this scheme due to the infrastructure investment requirements, the timeframes can be extended. So that's not a problem. It certainly can, but there are certain areas where we need to understand why. So the provider needs to explain why it's impractical or unreasonable, and then explanation could include an analysis of why there are no other feasible or alternatives that can be arranged for correction or corrective actions. The provider needs to provide the explanation to the department as well, not just to BSI. And the BSI auditor will confirm by records that the provider has notified the departments. We'll have to review those. And if our auditor agrees with the explanation, we should follow up with the non-conformity handling process that incorporates the view of the entire audit team under the scheme. As far as the recertification audits are concerned, the provider will be advised in writing of the inability to extend the certification cycle beyond 3 years. So we certainly can't do that. And even under ISMS 27001, we can't extend the certification beyond 3 years, because that is the date when it expires. The process for restoring expired certification under this scheme is up to 6 months, and the ability to go beyond 6, and there is an inability to go beyond 6 months. Having said that, when it comes to expiry and everything, I would suggest that you always keep in mind the base requirements of 27001 as well, because that's the fundamental on which the scheme is based. So any ISO 27001 certificate expires in 3 years' time. Most audits are delivered or planned for to be delivered in prior 3 months in advance, to make sure all or any non-conformities that are being raised are being addressed, closed off, accepted by the auditor, reports updated, certificate issued prior to that expiry date. So that's something that we always advise organizations to keep 3 months into account. So that's me. Obviously, I've been talking a lot. I haven't seen all the questions that have come up, but I would encourage, if there are any questions that you guys have got, and I can try and cover them off.
Dushyant, there aren't any questions in the chat function at this stage.
Okay. Okay. And what are the poll results, Irene?
Yes, we can share those. I'll just share them now.
Yeah. So what I'll try and do is I'll try and cover some of those areas that someone wanted to know based on the current experience we've had with the providers.
Can you see them on the screen now?
Not now, not yet.
Okay. Can you see them?
No, if you can read it out, that'll be good, Irene, if you don't mind.
I can't seem to share with everybody. They seem to come up on my screen, but what I can tell you is 50% of the result was for box 1, DESE ISMS certification process.
Yeah.
The second box as well for ISMS 27001 versus DESE ISMS is also 50%.
Yeah.
And then we had most people interested in the third and fourth option. So DESE ISMS audit requirements was at 67%.
Yeah.
And the scoping DESE ISMS also at 67%.
Okay,
with
fantastic.
The balance at 17% for ongoing maintenance for DESE ISMS.
Okay, okay, thank you. So if there aren't any questions, what I'll do is I'll try and cover a couple of questions or a couple of things that have come up or do come up from time to time as far as the providers are concerned. Just wanted to remind that as far as BSI is concerned, we've done quite a few audits towards the end of last year already, which was prior to the scheme being launched. The scheme was published in March. So we have number of providers who've either gone through the process, which is stage 1, stage 2, and then we have started having providers who are going through their first surveillance audit now, although the scheme's only less than 6 months or 7 months old. One of the key questions that has come about with the providers going through the certification process is a focus on what the scope of audit should look like. Okay, so that's a question that always comes in, saying, okay, we are an organization. There is a particular set or particular area or a particular department that's covered off within the deed, not the rest of the business. And what do we do? How do we go about it? I think that's one area that has come up in discussions quite a bit. Now, as far as the answer is concerned, there is no right or wrong. So the ISO 27001 allows you to scope or allows you to cover or start with a smaller scope and extend the scope further. So you can always start with a smaller department or a smaller area wherein you can get certified to ISO 27001 and then gradually increase the scope of your organization and make sure that bulk of the organization or entire organization is covered in due course. Now that step or that process is primarily taken where there are resource constraints and you are unable to complete all at one go. Having said that, because ISO is an international framework where you're not reporting to a particular regulator or a stakeholder, that's allowable and fine. But when it comes to the DESE ISMS, one of the key areas that you do need to look at is what does your deed say? What does that? What's the requirement within that? So if the requirement is your entire organization, then that entire organization needs to be covered. When I say entire organization, I'm talking about all the relevant sites, all employees that are part of the scope, as well as making sure your statement of applicability covers all the controls, which are 800 odd controls. So that's what the scope should look like. Wherein with 27001, the controls are 110, 114 odd controls, and you have the option to implement some or all, depending on what you want to do. And you can also have your own controls being introduced, added, depending on what framework you're using. So ISO allows you that flexibility. I've seen a number of organizations who follow NIST controls extensively, and they want to try and implement that within the organization, within their ISMS. It's allowed. But when it comes to a DESE ISMS scheme, what we need to make sure, and what our auditors will focus on, is making sure that those controls that are there, modified, new, updated, those are looked at regularly. So that's the first thing. The second question that has come about is around SOA and what and how do we cover, or how do we make it possible, or how do we manage it in a way wherein we are reviewing it regularly. So the first things first, I would suggest or recommend downloading or getting a hold of the routine ISM controls that are being downloaded, are available to be downloaded, I should say, and make sure you go through each one of those controls and describe how that is being implemented within the organizations. I've seen on occasions where it is not. And what it does is, when it is not being described, the auditor then has to go through each one of those controls to understand how it's been implemented, which takes a lot longer time. For us to go about justifying through to DESE or anyone else for a reduced time frame, and in certain cases we've done so, where organizations, what they've done is they've actually literally gone through each one of those SOA controls and said, this is how we implemented, so and so is the owner of the system, this is what we do, or this is the rationale based on our risk assessment why we haven't included or implemented a particular control, and we will at a future stage, and where and how. So the more you do that, and what it does, it ensures that your obviously audit time, cost, everything else or is reduced. But on the other end also, it gives you or anyone within the business an idea on how those controls are implemented and what are the controls that you will be reviewing periodically as well. And so, and I think that's something that needs to be done as soon as something's been released. I'm not saying implementation needs to be done. I'm talking about the review of the new controls that have come in and whether it's applicable or not. First question, not justify it. And then if it is applicable, or if it is something that is an area of interest that you are thinking of implementing, then you can start planning on what, how, who is in, should be involved, and how do we implement it. So I think that those are the two areas that I've seen has been a lot of discussion, a lot of questions around that. Last but not the least, I think one thing you need to make sure is if you're interested in managing or having a certification for 27001, all the base requirements as far as BSI is concerned, we need to make sure that we're delivering those, and those requirements need to be met at minimum. I think these are some of the things that come to my mind. If there are any other questions or anything you have, please feel free to pop in the chat box. But if you don't, we will certainly follow up with the recording as well as the presentation. You will have my details as well. So if there are any questions, query, please feel free to reach out. You can certainly email me, give me a call, whatever works. We can plan for a meeting and have a discussion if that works for you.
Dushyant, we just have one question that's come in, and that is, if there is a requirement, is there a requirement for a JASANS accredited ISO 27001 certification?
JASANS accredited. I didn't get that.
Yes, okay, does the 27001 certification required to be by JASANS?
No. So that can't be enforced or can't be made mandatory, and there is a simple reason for it. That was one of the concerns we'd also raised. So just for, I don't know who raised the question, but just someone who are not aware, as when the technical committee was formed, that was back last November, December, I'm talking about, I was part of that. And one of the key areas of discussion was that, and that has been clarified by JASANS, is that because of the non-competing clause that JASANS has with other accreditation bodies like UCAS, ANF, they are not enforcing, or they can't enforce anyone to be JASANS accredited. But the organization needs to meet all the requirements for 27001, which anyone can if they're already accredited by UCAS, ANF, or any other accreditation body that meets the criteria as far as JASANS is concerned for 27001. But for DESE, the way it works is it is looked at as a top-up. So base requirements are covered by 27001. Doesn't matter who it is accredited by. But for DESE requirements, we still need to go through the audit or the accreditation process as a top-up audit. And then JASANS will issue an accreditation as well. From a baseline perspective, JASANS has made it mandatory, which they'll be able to comment, but not us, that any organization who has not been accredited for 27001 for less than 2 years cannot apply under this scheme at this point, but in future they will be able to. I hope I've answered the question.
I believe so. That was all the questions that I had seen in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So if we don't have any questions, we'll part ways. First of all, and thanks for everyone who's joined us this morning. As I said, any questions, queries, please feel free to reach out. We'll be more than happy to help. If there is any guidance, any discussion, any documentation help that you require, we can certainly talk through what it is. Thank you.